just the simple fact that it's up us to take the process forward, I feel like that is more of a tangible sort of reality than maybe some of these more seemingly philosophical type discussions about, evolutionary impulses and things like that. Like, I feel like that's
Right.
a much easier entry point.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because you're kind of making a circle now here, where because in order to understand deep time and to understand evolution and to understand the whole, integral life perspective that we're talking about here, you need to understand it cognitively, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need to get it with your mind and know it, the logic of it and the rationality of it, and then that will trickle down into other areas, right? And hopefully encourage you to develop your motivation for, emotional growth or physical growth or, spiritual development, whatever it might be. But in a sense, we're doubling back into the idea that the cognitive line, understanding what we are talking about here, is the first step and perhaps the beginning of the fuel for the fire of evolution to start burning within our hearts.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I would agree with that. I think we also need to mention, that one has to be grounded in that, in spirit. And I think because Andrew Cohen spends so much time talking about, I guess what would be called maybe the traditional enlightenment, that kind of, really kind of grounded in being. And then from that, there's that deep time that you're talking about, Emily, and the way I understand it at least is that kind of urgency to evolve that comes from that source. But of course, yeah, we need that. We need to be very careful with our thinking and the way we kind of articulate things, because definitely, like what you're saying, Mark, is that we need to understand it intellectually and rationally before we can kind of be moral. And yeah, so
Yeah, definitely. And another thing I'm wanting to bring in here, just as because it's this is an interesting discussion. It has me thinking, what is sort of the entry point into this perspective, right?
Yeah.
Um, and sort of the person that comes to mind is Barbara Marx Hubbard, and her notion that, like, crisis is the thing that sort of drives humans to evolve,
hmm.
and
Yeah.
Stress.
that these sort of, and Ken Wilber says it all the time, it's not a coincidence that at the time when all of our problems are reaching a global level, that we're needing to make this sort of up leveling in consciousness where
Hmm.
we identify with the process of evolution and development in this way. It's not a
Yeah.
coincidence that these things are coming to a head at the same time. So I think
That's
that
right.
that might be um, the more tactile entry point for some people who might not
Yeah, that's like
have a
a
direct intuition of
yeah,
this
that's
perspective.
I like that.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to bring in integral consciousness from Steve McIntosh just to kind of because he does critique he critiques integral with Ken Wilber, and I guess that
Okay.
this ties in with the book, right? So I just thought I would read a couple of his kind of statements about some of his critiques about the notion of development, lines of development.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just read a few of them. So, a model of relative independent lines with no higher level organizational structure does not represent what contemporary development psychologists in fact believe. So, there's that point. Um, the conclusion that every research question posed by developmentalists corresponds to a separate and distinct line of development seems unlikely. The center of gravity phenomenon points to a larger enveloping structure that encompasses the multiple lines. And then the final point he makes is the idea that consciousness is empty is inconsistent with the idea of the actual structure of consciousness exhibited in the line of development. So, yeah, what I kind of got from that is that the sense that he's questioning the notion of, the sense that these are kind of independent lines. And I think what McIntosh kind of arguing is that is in more of a center of gravity that a lot of these lines move in cohesion with one another. There's a sense of,
Right.
and so I'm wondering what you guys think about that. Whether you'd be more leaning towards kind of the more integral Alan Combs kind of Ken Wilber kind of style of independent lines, or would you kind of side more with Steve McIntosh with a sense of a more kind of encompassing development? I guess it could be both, but yeah,
Yeah, what I
Hmm.
enjoy about that perspective is that he's really kind of bringing, I mean, if we're talking about all these different lines of development, suddenly the self is fractured into many parts. And so what Steve McIntosh does with those ideas that you just read
yeah,
is tries to bring everything back into kind of a unified, self, right? That is moving through, basically spiral dynamics, right? The levels of development and the memes, and that a person's worldview, their general orientation to the world, to life, has a sort of, yeah, a general sense of gravity, a place that is in a sense kind of like the hub where all of these different parts of the self meet.
yes,
Yeah. Hmm. What
yeah,
sort of comes to mind for me is and it's interesting. I don't know how permitting Ken Wilber's definition of the self is of this idea, but he always identifies the self as the locus of identification. So where the weight of how you would describe yourself sort of sits, but not just how you describe yourself. I mean, it's a whole. I think he calls it a vortex of
yeah,
identity or something along those lines. Um, but I wonder if his definition doesn't permit for this sort of process that Macintosh is bringing in, that they're all connected, and some more than others. And I'm guessing that that's where the developmental work is going to be going in the future, is
yeah,
sort of understanding exactly how these lines of development interact
yeah,
with
Yeah, and it's fascinating
one.
as I'm listening to you and as I'm watching this whole little conversation unfold. In a way, we have three different lines of, development, right? So we have these individual sort of parts, but they're coming together in this conversation and creating a whole, right? So,
yeah,
I mean, in a sense, these are the lines that, are talked about in the Wilberian and other models. This is also hopefully a meme, right? Or a level of development where we're all kind of on the same general page and